I'm going to read our text from Proverbs chapter 18, and then we're going to look at two other passages of Scripture. If you want to follow along, Numbers chapter 32 and Joshua chapter 22. I did not print out these chapters for you because there are many verses that we're going to look at. But if you just have one place where you want to mark your Bible, it would be Joshua chapter 22. We will get there in a few minutes. But our text is Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13. To answer before listening, that is folly and shame. You ever done that? You ever gotten your exercise jumping to conclusions? Maybe you've known somebody who jumped to a conclusion before they heard the whole story. Maybe you've been guilty of interrupting somebody and answering the question you thought they were going to ask, but that wasn't the question they were going to ask after all. Maybe you've listened to someone all the way through and still misunderstood what they were saying. I had not yet started working on this message when this happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I share an office at the hospital, and the person who was at the shared desk was having a conversation with a liaison from another company who was there in the building. They were talking about one of the patients. And our staff member asked this other person, "Do you have a date for that thing in July?" And I thought, that's kind of a personal question to ask somebody who's just a business acquaintance. And the person to whom the question was asked said, "Well, I'm married." And the person said, No. That's not what I meant. I meant was, do you know the date of that thing that's happening in July? She was asking, is it the 10th or the 8th or whenever? And both that person and I thought she was asking, do you have somebody to go with? And so we kind of laughed and acknowledged that sometimes it's possible to hear somebody and still misunderstand what they're saying. That was funny, and that was resolved, in a matter of seconds. But we all have lived long enough to have had some experiences that were not funny, that were caused by misunderstandings, or I heard somebody said this. Maybe you've passed judgment on a person before you knew all the facts. Maybe you've had judgment passed on you before someone else knew all the facts. One of the churches I pastored, I got a phone call from a pastor friend who said, we are having a panel discussion at our church about the different roles of women in society, and we need somebody who will speak on, and then he started to give this particular view of women in society, and he said, and we thought that you could do that for us. And I said, well, that's not what I believe. And there was a moment of silence. He goes, really? I said, yeah, I don't believe that. He goes, oh, okay, well, good, bye. There are times when you are judged by somebody who's never taken the time to sit down and ask you what you really believe about something, or they misheard something about you. The college we attended, Donna and I, was supported by people who did not have a whole lot of money, but it was a particular niche in the Christian movement that there weren't a whole lot of places you could send your kids to get an education in harmony with those beliefs. And so the place we went was one of them, and people seriously sacrificed to send their children to that school. The teachers sacrificed to be there. My dad was on staff there with a master's degree. He made, and this is an honest truth, less than $150 a month teaching there. So we're talking about sacrifice that people made to be there. Our president was getting up in age and had been having problems with his vision. and found out that he had cataracts on both eyes. A few weeks later, the school got a call from an irate supporter in another state saying, we sacrifice to send our children there. We sacrifice, and all we hear about is the sacrifice that you all are making. And now we hear that the president is driving 2 Cadillacs. You get in trouble when you don't check it out. That's a true story. And they were irate, and they were ready to pull their support because the president down there driving 2 Cadillacs. Don't get your exercise jumping to conclusions. Now, I told you we're going to go to Joshua 22, and we are, but first we're going to go to Numbers 32, because Joshua 22 wouldn't even be in the Bible if it weren't for Numbers 32. Here's what happens. You know the history. You know the children of Israel are wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. You may remember they're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years because when God told them at Kadesh Barnea, it's time to go into the promised land, and Moses sent the spies into the promised land for 40 days, they came back, and 10 of them, other than Joshua and Caleb, said, oh man, there's giants in the land, we shouldn't do this. And so the children of Israel, not the first time the majority's been wrong, the children of Israel said, oh, we can't do it, and we're not going to go. And God said, okay. So for every day the spies were in that land, you're going to spend a year wandering in the wilderness. Well, the 40 years are up. Moses is getting ready to pass the torch on to Joshua when the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh get together and go to Moses and say in Numbers 32, we have so much cattle and livestock that we don't want to go across the Jordan to the promised land. Now, we know you've been telling us for 40 years about this promised land that we're supposed to go to, but we don't want to do that. We want our inheritance on the east side of Jordan, the wilderness side of Jordan, where we are, because there's a lot of property there for our herds, for our livestock. It was a business decision, not a spiritual decision. It was a decision based on finances, not based on faith. And so they say, we want to stay doing this. Now, the half tribe of Manasseh we read about in verse 33, that they joined with Reuben and Gad. And so you will hear me say today, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. Because of the 12 tribes that were there, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and the tribe of Manasseh split. And half of them joined with Reuben and Gad and said, we want to stay on the wilderness side of the Jordan. Moses says, don't you remember the story of what happened 40 years ago at Kadesh Barnea? When the children of Israel said, we don't want to go into the promised land, and you've been in the wilderness all these 40 years. You're going to do the same thing. And they say, but we don't want what God has for us. Now, they didn't say it in so many words, but that's what they said. We want to stay on the wilderness side of the Jordan because we see there's more land there for our livestock. Financial decision, not a faith decision. Business decision, not a spiritual decision. Moses is quite irate. And actually in verse 14, he calls them a brood of sinners. He says, you're going to make the Lord angry with us again. And then they say, basically, verse 17, here's what we will do. If you'll let us stay on the east side of Jordan, we will send our army with the rest of the tribes, and we will stay with them until they conquer the land. And then we'll come back on the other side of Jordan. And Moses said, okay. And he says to Joshua, here's the deal. This isn't what God wanted them to do, but they have decided that they will send their soldiers and they will fight with the other 9.5 tribes until we've conquered the promised land. Then they will go back home to their families. He said, if they don't do it, basically wipe them out. But they've said this is what they're going to do. Lesson number one through this story. God may let your bad decisions stand, but there will be consequences. It's very important that we understand that. There's another verse in the Psalms that says about another time in the history of Israel that God gave them the desires of their heart, but he sent leanness to their souls. You may make a decision that's out of God's will for you, and God may let that decision stand, but there will be consequences sooner or later to that bad decision. Now we come to Joshua 22. The only reason, as I said, that Joshua 22 is in the Bible is because of the decision that Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh made to want their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan. I preached through Joshua several years ago and learned as I was doing that series that it took 7 years for the children of Israel to conquer the promised land. So Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh have been fighting for 7 years for an inheritance that they would never receive because they were going back to the east side of the Jordan. So at least you got to give them some props for keeping their word. But then it gets time, and Joshua says to them, okay, you can go back home. I found myself kind of stuck at the half tribe of Manasseh. You read in Civil War history about families that were divided between the two sides in the conflict. Here's a whole tribe that's divided. And you wonder, were families separated? Did one brother go west and one brother stay east? What was the emotional impact of that decision that they made? But they are getting ready now to go back across the Jordan River. And by the way, I don't know how they got back across it. It must not have been flood stage, because you remember they got across it the first time miraculously when God parted the waters. God didn't part the waters for them to get back across. They had to find their own way back across. When you're doing God's work and you're doing it in obedience to God, he's going to provide for you. When you decide you're going to go out on your own, he's going to let you go out on your own. So they are at the river, ready to go back east to their inheritance on the wilderness side of Jordan. And they say to themselves in verse 10, we need to build an altar. Now, why did they do that? I'm going to jump ahead in the story where we learn their reasoning, and then we'll go back and see what happened because of it. They decide we need to build some kind of a memorial or a monument so that our children on the east side of the Jordan will know that we serve the same God as the ones on the west side of the Jordan. So we'll build this altar on the west side of the Jordan, and we'll always point our children to it as the symbol that we are all on the same place. Now here's the problem. God had said to the children of Israel, when you get to the promised land, you are to worship me at Shiloh. That's where you go to worship me. God always designated a place for his people to worship. He said, you come and worship to me at Shiloh. Another thing that's important is that the Jews never built an altar except to offer sacrifices to God. If there was an altar built for another reason, it was always to burn a sacrifice to a false god. Altars were never built to be memorials. Memorials had been built, but an altar was never built to be a memorial. You were supposed to worship God at Shiloh. That's the only place. And so here's what the 2.5 tribes think. Verses 24 and 25. We fear that someday your descendants from the west side of the Jordan will say to ours on the east side of the Jordan, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you have no share in the Lord. Now wait a minute. 2 things wrong with that. First of all, I would think that the children asking the questions would be the ones still in the wilderness, saying, wait a minute, aren't those our cousins over there? Those are our relatives over there. How come we're over here? And secondly, God did not put the Jordan River there as a boundary between them. Their disobedience put the boundary between them. They weren't supposed to be on the east side of the Jordan. They were supposed to be with the other tribes of Israel on the west side of Jordan. So a lot of times we make decisions and those decisions have consequences. Don't blame God for them. We're over here on the east side of Jordan. Y'all are over there on the west side of Jordan. And God put this big river between us. No, God didn't. Because you're supposed to be on the west with everybody else. So when you end up paying the price for your disobedience, don't blame God. When you start experiencing the consequences for making a bad decision, don't blame God. And so they said, we want this, verse 28. So if they say, do you serve the same God? We will say, look at the replica of the Lord's altar. We did not build it for burnt offerings and sacrifices, but as a witness. That altar was not supposed to be a witness. The altar was supposed to be a place to burn sacrifices. Two wrongs don't make a right. And they're saying, in essence, we built this to remind us that we need to go to Shiloh to worship God. They were aware, as they made the decision, that decision was going to cause them to distance themselves from God. Because they're saying, in essence, we had to build this altar to remind us that we're supposed to go over to the west side of the Jordan and go to Shiloh to worship God. But since we're over here on the east side of Jordan, it's going to take more of an effort, so we need to be reminded. Do you have to be reminded sometimes to serve God? Do you have to be reminded of what you're supposed to do? So that was their mentality. Their mentality was, we need this as a memorial so that we'll remember that we serve the same God as the 9.5 tribes on the west side of Jordan. So that's their rationale. But what happens is this. The other 9.5 tribes reach the conclusion that since an altar was only to be built to burn offerings and sacrifices to either the true God, and that had to be in Shiloh, or else it was to worship a false god. Verse 11, when the Israelites heard that they had built the altar, the whole assembly gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. So the 9.5 tribes see the altar. They hear that this altar is being built. They jump to the conclusion that those 2.5 tribes are already serving a false god. And they gather to go to war. The King James in verse 11 says, when they heard say, maybe that's where hearsay comes from. When they heard say that the altar was being built, they jumped from I heard to I know. You ever made that jump? You hear something, and the next step is, well, I know that. And that's what the 9.5 tribes did. They heard that the 2.5 tribes had built an altar. They jumped to the conclusion and said, we know that they're going to serve a false god, so we got to go get them. Which brings me back to my text in Proverbs 18, to answer before listening, that is folly and shame. James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So what happens is the 9.5 tribes immediately jump to the wrong conclusion. And they decide it's time to go to war. But somebody, and we don't know exactly who, But somebody said, maybe we should check it out first. And in verse 13, they send Phinehas to go to them with 10 of the chief men. And they basically said, find out what's going on. Thank God for Phinehas. Have the courage to check things out by going to the source. How many times, in press conferences, so-and-so said this. What do you have to say about that? And then that person has to respond to what they heard the other person said. I would love sometime for somebody to say, I did not hear them say that. I don't know the context in which they said that. I'm not sure that they said that. And I've not had a chance to talk to them about it. After I check it out with them, then I'll answer your question. But that's not our society anymore. We love jumping to conclusions and creating problems. Have the courage to check things out. Go to the source. So Phinehas and the other 10 go down there and they say, what's going on? And that's when they say, no, this is what we were trying to do. There's a very famous illustration in the early days of the church between two of the leading theologians, Cyril and Theodoret. They heard about each other and heard what each other believed and basically excommunicated each other from the church. And then one day they happened to be in the same city and happened to meet and happened to sit down and have a conversation and found out they both believed the same thing. Go to the source. There's no substitute for sitting down and talking things through. Communication clears up confusion. And if you've been in church, if you've been in business, if you've been in your family, you know how many times confusion is caused by, what so-and-so said? Do you know what he said? Do you know what she said? And nobody goes and sits down with the source, and it just blows out of proportion. Fortunately, there was a peaceful resolution. So verse 33, they were glad to hear the report, and they talked no more about going to war against them. What I wondered, I guess because I have a bad streak, what I wondered is, were the 9.5 tribes a little bit disappointed, that they didn't get to go to war? Have you ever already got a big argument built up against somebody, and then lo and behold, you found out that it was based on a false pretense? Oh man, I wanted to believe that about them. Well, thank God for a peaceful resolution. So that's the first part of the lesson from Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh. Misunderstandings will occur. That's just life. Sometimes your best intentions will be misinterpreted. So don't stop doing right because you're afraid of being misjudged. However, don't get your exercise jumping to conclusions. Go to the source. If it's bothersome to you, I really heard that so-and-so said this. Go to the source. And conversely, be ready to explain yourself. Romans 14:16 says, do not let what you know is good to be spoken of as evil. So that's part of the story. Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh make a decision that they want their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan. They build an altar as a memorial. Chaos potentially ensues. But that's not the end of the story. We know what happened to Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. Decisions have consequences. The question is, the decisions that you are making, in which direction are they leading you? Are they leading you closer to God, or are they leading you further away from God? Remember, I said this was a decision based on business. God's plan was for Reuben and Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh to cross the Jordan and live in the promised land with the other 9.5 tribes. That was God's plan. But they made a financial decision based on, we want more land for our herds. And so they stay on the wilderness side. And God let that decision stand. But as I've told you a couple of times, there will be consequences. Just because God, in quotation marks, allows you to do something, it does not mean it's his will for you, and it does not mean that he's going to bless you as you do it. Well, God let me do this. Yeah, but you knew it wasn't his will. Don't expect him to bless you while you're living in disobedience. But they chose cattle over their children. They chose finances over their faith. They knew that they were further away from Shiloh. I have often said, I wish that we had enough financial resources that we could buy a little, or do a timeshare, buy a little condo or something on the beach. But I also wish that the beach was only like an hour and a half away. I don't like driving, anything past about 90 minutes and it's too far. I'm too old, it's too far. Apparently somebody did a survey of one of these timeshare companies or something and said that if you have to travel over 3 hours to it, you're not going to go very often. No matter how much you think you are, it's just too much effort. So these 2.5 tribes are not only geographically distant from Shiloh, they've got to cross the Jordan River every time they go to Shiloh to worship. And they've put a barrier between them and their families and the worship of God. And those decisions had consequences. Choosing their cattle over their children had consequences. We read about it in 1 Chronicles chapter 5, talking about Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Verses 25 and 26. They, speaking of Reuben, Gad, the half-tribe of Manasseh, were unfaithful to the God of their fathers, and they prostituted themselves to the gods of the peoples of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of a king that you studied about in world history, Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and he took Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh into exile. The first tribes of Israel to serve false gods were Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. The first tribes of Israel to be taken into captivity were Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Decisions have consequences. Anytime your decision is leading you away from God, there's going to be consequences. So the decisions that you're making every day, are they leading you closer to God, or are they drawing you away from God? And so when you list the lessons from this event, you've got to add lesson number 4, which is the larger lesson. None of the issue would have happened if the 2.5 tribes had obeyed God and gone into the promised land. If they had just obeyed and went where God wanted them to go, these issues would not have happened. As I told you, Joshua 22 wouldn't even be in the Bible. Be obedient. Your decisions have unintended consequences. And sometimes we don't care. There are people who make decisions all the time, and they could echo remember the king who said, as long as there's peace in my day, I don't really care what happens to our children. Decisions have consequences. Every time we choose to distance ourselves from God, there are going to be consequences, often for generations to follow. So don't get your exercise jumping to conclusions. Check it out. But more importantly, make sure that you're living in obedience to God, so some of those questions don't even have to come up. Father, help us. First of all, help us in this society where gossip is so pervasive and character assassination seems to be the rule of the day. Help us to go to the source. Help us to check things out for ourselves and not go by, well, we heard say this. But Lord, also, and more important, help us to make decisions based on faith and obedience. May we learn the serious lesson that these 2.5 tribes put their finances ahead of their faith, and their children went into captivity first. Help us, Father, to stay true to you. Help us to be obedient to you. May our decisions draw us and those that we influence closer to you, I pray. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace, now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Thanks for coming out today.